Welcome back to Inside City Hall, where we are turning back to tonight's top story. Today, a criminal complaint was filed against Andrew Cuomo in Albany, charging him with forcibly touching an executive assistant last year. According to the Albany County Sheriff's Office, Cuomo must appear in court in Albany on November 17th to face the misdemeanor charge. Here now to talk about the charges is Cynthia Godsoe. She's a criminal law professor at Brooklyn Law School. Welcome to the program. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Absolutely. And Professor, when we are told that he has to appear on the 17th, is that mandatory? Is that optional? Does that amount to being arrested?
It doesn't amount to being arrested, but it definitely, it is not optional. I'm assuming that it's the arraignment that he has to show up. They're actually giving him a lot of leeway that sometimes a lot of people accused of crimes don't get, to have some advance notice. But he definitely has to appear. He can't not show up.
Got it. In New York City, things would possibly be handled differently, but I was surprised to see the statement from the Albany County District Attorney saying they had no knowledge that this complaint was being filed. How unusual is that?
In my experience, which is only in New York City, yeah, I agree. It's very, very unusual. I don't know, what happens in Albany, but in New York City, it would definitely be the DAs, the district attorneys for the various boroughs filing the complaints or the indictments, bringing an indictment before a grand jury. It would not be the sheriff independently doing this. Yeah,
and the reason for that is in New York, again, in New York City, the DA might say, like, listen, we think this is a junk case. We don't think the evidence holds up. We've got other priorities. As a matter of policy, we're not going to prosecute somebody for, a quarter of an ounce of marijuana or something like that. Is there a chance that that might be the resolution of this in Albany County?
Yeah, great question. I do think you're absolutely right that, of course, DAs or prosecutors should have, and they also have ethical obligations as lawyers, and they're the only lawyers who have an ethical obligation to do justice, which is why some of the charges, they can't just bring any charge that law enforcement brings to them. I have to say, though, I doubt that that would happen in this case, because I don't think, especially given the other allegations against Cuomo, that it really is. It's not a minor case in the same way that many of the cases we see, unfortunately, still are minor cases, whether it's turnstile jumping or, like you said, a very small amount of marijuana. But this is a more major case. It's, a sex crime that, even though this is one of, the more minor sex crimes, it still is a violent crime. And I think that it wouldn't be necessarily appropriate to drop it at this stage.
As the case, if assuming it does go forward, there would be an exchange of evidence, right? There's a discovery process. The DA would have to disclose everything that they know. The defense would have to start making plans, bring forward its own witnesses or other evidence. And what happens after that?
Right. So most commonly, first of all, in terms of DAs disclosing everything, it's actually interesting. We've had these battles like in very recent years over discovery reform, and Cuomo has actually, blocked some of them, often due to pressure from the Prosecutors Association, the New York Prosecutors Association. So they actually we don't have full open file discovery in New York State, but they do have to turn over some things, the prosecutors. But the process afterwards, normally 97% of criminal cases plead out, but there's mostly defendants who have a lot of pressures on them that Cuomo doesn't have, right? They're low income, they're incarcerated pending the trial. We know that's especially dangerous and difficult right now in New York City with the conditions at Rikers. But there's a lot of pressure to plead. I don't think Cuomo will have those pressures necessarily. And so it will probably proceed to trial, which isn't usual, especially for a misdemeanor A, which this is, which is, a serious case, but not as serious as many cases. But he doesn't have the same pressures to plead. So I would assume that it would proceed to trial.
And when the former governor's attorney says that this is politically motivated, does that have any particular standing in court?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. It may be politically motivated, but on the other hand, there is a lot of evidence and a lot of, this is not the only case. Many of them are barred by the statute of limitations, but there clearly, are a lot of concerns about his behavior. And it definitely doesn't have any standing. That's not a defense. to something often that actually prevents people from being prosecuted, which seems, kind of unfair. We've seen scandals like that in the past, even in New York City with high-profile individuals not being prosecuted. But it certainly is not a defense to this kind of conduct.
And then finally, I seem to remember in the dim recesses of my memory from Brooklyn Law School that harmful and offensive touching can give rise to civil liability, meaning the complaining witness in this case could also sue Andrew Cuomo, right?
Absolutely. And first of all, proud that you're a Brooklyn grad. But yes, absolutely. And we know it's a lower standard of proof. So beyond a reasonable doubt, very high standard of proof, although this is one of the stronger cases, I have to say, given, all the testimony in the report, just based on the Attorney General's report. But the civil liability standard is only preponderance of evidence. So definitely she could sue. It seems, increasingly likely with high profile I don't want to say perpetrators because we don't know yet, but high profile people who are accused of crimes that civil liability can often bring redress to victims that they can't necessarily get through the criminal system.
Okay, sounds like we're going to be living with this for a number of weeks or even months, potentially. Thanks so much for joining us, Professor Godsoe.
Thank you.
Okay, let's take a break now. When we come back, we'll turn our attention to Washington, D.C. President Biden announced a deal today on what he called a historic framework. But then there was little progress in Congress. We'll explain why in just a minute. Stay with us.